In a snowy Vermont town, a lonely Navy SEAL heard a violin crying outside a warm diner. The man playing it was not just a homeless stranger, but an old Marine carrying a promise from a fallen friend. When the diner owner shattered that violin, everyone looked away, except Elias and his German shepherd, Maddox. But one broken instrument would uncover something colder than winter itself. A stolen home, a town full of rumors, and an old soldier nearly erased by silence. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the first note of someone's healing. If this story touches your heart, tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep creating stories like this. Snow came down over Brightpine, Vermont, with the quiet confidence of something ancient. It did not fall in a rage that evening. It drifted, silver and steady, coating the roofs of bakery awnings, the iron backs of street benches, the pine garlands tied along Main Street. The whole town seemed to glow beneath it. Shop windows shone gold. A red neon sign blinked above the pharmacy. People hurried along the sidewalks with their shoulders raised, their breath blooming white before their faces, each person carrying some small private hunger toward warmth. Inside North Star Grill, winter had been kept at bay by yellow lamps, hot coffee, and the smell of butter frying on the griddle. Truckers sat with both hands wrapped around mugs. A pair of road workers argued softly over the best snow tires. An old couple shared meatloaf beneath the framed photographs of Brightpine's better years, back when the mills still ran and no one had yet learned to call decline by prettier names like redevelopment. Elias Ward sat alone near the front window. He had chosen the booth because it let him see the door, the street, and the reflection of most of the room in the glass. Old habits did not ask permission before surviving. At 51, Elias carried himself with the controlled stillness of a man who had once been trained to notice the second before trouble arrived. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with broad shoulders made not for show but for labor. The olive-drab combat shirt beneath his winter coat fit close across his chest, its camouflage sleeves marked by horizontal bands around the upper arms. The shirt looked almost too purposeful for a diner, but on him it felt less like costume than weather, something he had worn so long the world had accepted it as part of him. His face was clean-shaven, angular, and sun-browned by years outdoors. A strong jaw, deep-set gray-blue eyes, and neatly cut undercut hair dark at the crown, but silvering at the sides, gave him the look of a man who had not surrendered to age, only negotiated terms with it. On the floor beside his booth lay Maddox. The German shepherd rested with his front paws crossed, black saddle fur dark against the tile, golden chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. One ear stood sharp. The other bore a small scar near the edge that made it tilt slightly when he listened. He looked calm enough to be mistaken for sleepy, but Elias knew better. Maddox missed nothing. Not the scrape of chairs, not the clatter of dropped silverware, not the tremor in a stranger's voice when fear tried to dress itself as politeness. Elias had nearly finished his coffee when the sound came through the window. At first it was only a thin thread beneath the diner noise, a violin, not a polished performance. Not the clean, proud sound of a concert hall. The notes wavered in the cold, slipping now and then, reaching for a melody the player's hands could no longer fully hold. But there was something in it that made Elias set down his mug. The music seemed to stand outside the glass like someone too proud to knock. Maddox lifted his head. Elias looked past his own reflection and saw the old man beneath the street lamp. He stood at the edge of the sidewalk where the shoveled path narrowed near the diner entrance. His coat was gray wool, frayed at the cuffs and patched near one pocket. A brown knit cap held down long, silver hair that still escaped in wild strands around his ears. His beard had grown uneven, not by fashion, but by circumstance. The fingers holding the bow were bare at the tips, poking through fingerless gloves, red from cold. A dented violin case lay open near his boots with a few coins inside. Most people walked around him the way water moves around a stone. Not cruelly, not always. Some looked embarrassed, some looked annoyed. Some simply looked away with the practiced efficiency of decent people who had decided not to feel one more thing that day. The old man played on. A waitress paused near Elias's booth, coffee pot in hand. Her eyes flicked toward the window. "Amos again," she murmured, not unkindly, but not kindly enough to matter. Elias glanced up. "Amos?" "Amos Whitaker." She refilled his mug, though he had not asked. "Used to have a little place over on Juniper Row, I think. Now he plays out there when the weather gets bad enough to make people feel guilty." There was a tired joke in her voice, the kind small towns used when truth had become too heavy to lift. Outside, Amos Whitaker shifted his weight. The bow trembled once, then found the melody again. Maddox rose, not quickly, not with alarm. He simply stood as if some order had been given in a language only dogs and broken men understood. His amber eyes fixed on the window, and a soft sound moved in his throat. Not a growl, not yet, but a question. Elias felt it then, the thing he had spent years trying to keep at a distance. The pull, the dangerous little hook of another person's suffering catching beneath his ribs. He looked away. His dinner sat half-eaten in front of him. Hot beef stew, bread with melted butter, a clean fork, a clean table. He could pay, leave through the side door, and tell himself the old man had survived worse than snow. Men like Elias had many skills, and one of them was making silence sound like discipline. Then the music faltered, not stopped. Faltered. One note bent so sharply that several people in the diner turned toward the window. A man near the counter muttered something about bad for business. Someone laughed under his breath. From behind the register, Dalton Pruitt looked up. Dalton owned North Star Grill, though the way he spoke of it made it sound more like a throne than a restaurant. He was broad and well-dressed, with a crisp white shirt beneath a dark vest and a leather apron that looked too expensive to have met much grease. His sandy blonde hair was slicked back, his face flushed with the easy irritation of a man who had rarely been told no by anyone who mattered. He wiped his hands on a towel and stared toward the window. "Not tonight," Dalton said. No one answered him. He came around the counter and moved toward the front door. His signet ring flashed gold as he shoved it open. A gust of snow and cold air burst into the diner, making napkins flutter and customers hunch over their plates. Elias did not move yet. Maddox did. The shepherd stepped closer to the window, ears high, body still. Outside, Dalton planted himself in front of Amos. The glass muffled his words, but Elias could read enough in the shape of the man's mouth, the impatient slash of his hand, the way Amos lowered the violin slightly, but did not step back. Amos said something, maybe an apology, maybe a request. Dalton pointed down the sidewalk. Amos shook his head once and lifted the violin case by its strap. He seemed to be trying to gather himself, trying to obey with dignity, which was a sad little art poor men learned in public places. Then Dalton grabbed the violin. It happened fast enough that some people later could call it an accident and almost believe themselves. Dalton seized the neck of the instrument, probably meaning to pull it away, probably meaning to show the watching street that he still controlled the doorway to his kingdom. Amos held on, not with strength, but with panic. The bow slipped from his hand. The violin twisted between them. Wood struck stone. The sound was small. That was the worst part. Not dramatic, not thunderous. Just a brittle crack beneath the wind, a dry breaking, as if winter had snapped a bird's wing between its fingers. The diner went still. Amos stared down. The violin lay on the step in two wounded pieces. Strings curled loose, one side of the body split open. For a moment the old man did not bend. He simply stood there beneath the falling snow, his hands still shaped around an instrument that was no longer in them. Maddox pressed his nose to the glass. A low growl finally came. Elias stood. He did not remember deciding to do it. 1 second he was inside, warm and separate. The next he was pulling on his coat, dropping cash beside his plate, and moving toward the door with Maddox at his left knee. The cold hit him hard when he stepped outside. Dalton turned, annoyed at first, then wary when he recognized him. Most people in Brightpine knew Elias Ward by sight, the former Navy man from the Lake Road, the one who worked bridge steel and never stayed long after town meetings, the one whose dog obeyed hand signals better than most men obeyed laws. "It was an accident," Dalton said before Elias spoke. Amos had knelt in the snow. He was gathering the broken pieces of the violin with hands that shook so badly he could barely close his fingers around them. His eyes were wet, but no tear had fallen. Somehow that restraint made the grief harder to look at. Elias stopped beside him. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Amos gave a laugh with no humor in it. "Depends which part of me you mean." His voice was rough, old smoke over gravel. He did not look up. He kept trying to place the broken bridge of the violin back where it belonged, though even Elias could see it would not hold. Dalton exhaled sharply. "He was blocking the entrance. Customers have complained. I asked him to move." He pulled back, and it dropped. A woman near the diner window lifted her phone a little higher. Elias noticed the red recording light on the screen. So did Dalton. Elias turned to him. "Then you'll want to make it right." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "If it was an accident," Elias said, his voice even, "you'll pay for the damage." A few customers had come closer to the glass. Their faces hovered there, pale ovals in the fogged window, watching now that the story had become safe enough to observe. Dalton glanced at them, then back at Elias. "You don't know what that thing was worth?" "No," Elias said. "But he does." Amos shook his head without rising. "No need. I'll manage." The words had the worn smoothness of repetition. Elias wondered how many times in his life Amos had said them to keep from asking the world for anything it would later punish him for needing. Maddox stepped forward and lowered his head beside the broken violin. He did not sniff it like an object. He regarded it solemnly, almost as if standing watch. Something changed in Amos's face. For the first time, he looked at the dog. "Well," the old man whispered, "aren't you a handsome judge?" The smallest smile touched Elias's mouth and vanished. Dalton reached into his wallet with stiff, angry movements. He pulled out bills and held them out like they smelled bad. Amos did not take them at first. Elias did. He counted the money, added more from his own wallet, and folded the stack before placing it gently into Amos's hand. "For repair," he said. "Or another one." Amos stared at the money as if it had become heavier than law. "I wasn't begging for trouble." "No," Elias said. "Trouble came out the door." Dalton's face reddened. His ringed hand curled once at his side. "You made your point, Ward." Elias met his eyes. Not yet. For a second the cold seemed to sharpen around them. Then Elias looked back at Amos and softened his voice. "Do you have somewhere warm tonight?" Amos tucked the broken violin pieces against his chest with surprising care. "I have a roof." "A roof and a place warm aren't always the same thing." The old man's eyes flicked up then, pale blue-gray beneath snow-damp lashes. There was pride there and exhaustion, and something Elias recognized too well, a man guarding the last room inside himself that had not been taken. "I've got a porch that knows my name," Amos said. "That's more than some can claim." It was almost funny. Almost. Maddox gave a small whine. Amos looked down at him again, and this time his expression broke a little around the edges. He reached one hand toward the shepherd, then stopped halfway, asking permission without words. Elias gave a faint nod. Maddox stepped in and pressed his head under the old man's palm. Amos closed his fingers into the thick fur behind the dog's ear. His hand trembled less there. The snow kept falling around them. Brightpine storefront lights shimmered on the white street. Inside the diner, warmth waited behind glass, but no one seemed eager to return to it just yet. Elias wanted to say more. He wanted to ask the old man where he slept, when he last ate, why a broken violin looked in his arms like a fallen flag. But questions could become knives if pressed too soon. So he said only, "Take care of that ankle on the east sidewalk. Ice is bad near the pharmacy." Amos gave him a sidelong look. "You always give orders this gently?" "Only when ignored." That earned a thin, crackling laugh. Amos tucked the money deep into his inner coat pocket. Then he gathered the bow, the case, and the broken violin, holding them all with a dignity that made the ruin feel ceremonial. He nodded once to Elias, once to Maddox, and not at all to Dalton. Then he turned and walked down Main Street into the falling snow. The old man moved slowly, but he did not shuffle. There was still a line of discipline hidden beneath the years, a memory of marching that poverty had not quite erased. Elias watched until the street lamp swallowed him, until the violin case became a dark shape against the white, until even that vanished beyond the glow of the shops. Behind him, Dalton opened the diner door. "You cost me money tonight," he said. Elias did not turn around. "No, you did." Maddox remained facing the street. The dog's ears stayed lifted long after Amos disappeared, as if some part of him still heard the broken music moving through the snow. Elias finally looked down at the shepherd. "Come on." But as he returned to the diner to collect his coat and leave, the warmth inside no longer felt the same. The coffee smelled burnt. The lights looked too yellow. The laughter at the counter had become careful and false. Outside, winter continued laying its clean white hand over Brightpine, and somewhere beyond the bright windows, an old man carried a broken violin through the snow as if it were the last living witness to a promise no one else remembered. By morning, Brightpine had lost its postcard softness. The snow was still beautiful from a distance. It lay bright across rooftops and pine branches, catching the weak sun in blue-white flashes. But beauty changed its nature when a man had to stand on steel beams above a frozen river with wind needling through his gloves. Out on the North Bridge project, winter was no longer scenery. It was weight, it was ice on the ladder rungs, snow packed into boot treads, breath freezing against scarf wool, and every sound made sharper by the cold. Elias Ward spent the day tightening bolts along a temporary support frame while the river moved black and slow beneath the bridge. He worked the way he did most things, quietly, thoroughly, without asking the world to notice. His olive-drab combat shirt was hidden beneath a heavy canvas work jacket now, the camouflage sleeves only showing when he reached for tools. Snow gathered along his shoulders and melted in dark patches near the collar. His hand stayed steady, even when the wind shoved hard enough to make younger workers curse and grab the rail. Near noon, the site manager, Brent Tallow, called him over beside a stack of salt-stained lumber. Brent was not a cruel man. That made the conversation worse. He was built like a barrel, with a red nose, a gray beard full of ice crystals, and the uneasy look of someone delivering bad news he had already rehearsed badly. "Ward," Brent said, keeping his voice low, "we're cutting your hours this week." Elias looked past him toward the bridge. "Weather?" "Weather. Budget. Schedule changes." Brent scratched at his beard with a gloved hand. "You know how these things go." Elias did know how things went. He knew when a man was saying the words he had been given instead of the truth he believed. "How many hours?" Elias asked. Brent's eyes shifted. "Half. For now?" The wind moved between them. For now. 2 small words that could hold a threat without ever admitting one. Elias nodded once. "All right." Brent seemed relieved and ashamed at the same time. He clapped Elias once on the arm, then walked away too quickly. Elias returned to his tools, but the rhythm of the day had changed. The wrench felt heavier. The cold reached deeper. It was not the lost money that bothered him most, though money mattered when winter stretched long and the lake road ate fuel like a starving thing. What bothered him was the cleanliness of it. No shouting, no accusation. Just a quiet adjustment made somewhere warm by someone who did not have to stand in the wind. Near the end of the shortened shift, one of the welders slowed beside him. Owen Pike was a wiry man in his late 40s with a permanent squint and a habit of speaking only when the sentence could not be avoided. He kept his hood up and his voice lower than the storm. "Pruitts don't like being embarrassed," Owen muttered. Elias tightened the last bolt. "That advice or gossip?" "Warning." Owen kept walking. "Cheaper than both." Then he was gone, leaving only boot marks and a thin line of cigarette smoke in the snow. Elias stood there a moment longer, looking toward Brightpine's church steeple in the distance. The town looked harmless from the bridge, white roofs, warm windows, a red flag snapping near the municipal building. Small towns were good at that. From far enough away, even a fist could look like a hand waving. By late afternoon, the light had begun to fail. Elias drove home along the road to Morrow Lake with Maddox in the passenger seat instead of the back. The shepherd sat upright, black and gold fur brushing the seat, scarred ear tilted toward the windshield as if listening to something beneath the engine. Elias had picked him up from the small kennel shed near the work site after the shift. Maddox had spent the day restless, according to the young guard who watched the equipment. "Storm's got him edgy," the kid had said. Maybe, but Maddox was not afraid of weather. The road narrowed as they left the town center behind. Pine trees closed in on both sides, their branches heavy with snow. The sky had a pewter color now, and the headlights cut tunnels through the falling flakes. Every few minutes, the tires hissed over hidden ice, and Elias adjusted without thinking. He passed the old feed store, the frozen turnout near the quarry road, then the abandoned storage shed where the town used to keep summer festival booths before the roof began to sag. Maddox whined. It was a low sound, almost swallowed by the truck heater. Elias glanced at him. "What?" The shepherd pushed his nose toward the passenger window. His breath fogged the glass in a sudden oval. His body had gone still in that particular way Elias knew too well, not excitement, not curiosity. Attention. Elias eased off the gas. At first he saw nothing but the road shoulder, snowbanks, and the crooked shape of the abandoned shed. Then the headlights shifted over a dark form near the ditch. A coat. No, a man. Elias hit the brakes carefully, stopping without sliding. Maddox was already standing with his front paws braced against the floorboard. "Stay," Elias said. Maddox stayed, but only because the word came from Elias. The cold slammed into the cab when Elias opened the door. Snow swept across his face. He reached the shape in 6 strides and dropped to one knee. The old man lay curled on his side near the road, half covered by fresh snow. Amos Whitaker. For a second, Elias's mind rejected the sight, not because it was impossible, but because it was too exact, as if the night before had not ended but merely changed locations. Amos's face was pale beneath his wild silver hair. His lips had a bluish cast. One hand clutched his ankle. The other was tucked inside his coat, as if guarding something that was no longer there. "Amos!" The old man's eyelids fluttered. "I was wondering," he rasped, "when the angels started driving Fords." Elias exhaled once, almost a laugh, almost not. "You hurt anywhere besides the ankle?" "My pride took the first blow. Ankle came second." "Can you move your toes?" Amos grimaced and tried. "They have submitted a formal complaint." Elias glanced back at the truck. Maddox had both front paws on the seat now, watching through the open door, ears high. "Were you hit by a car?" Elias asked. "No car." Amos swallowed. "Two men, young enough to be stupid, old enough to know better." Elias's expression did not change, but something inside him went very quiet. He helped Amos sit up slowly. The old man hissed through his teeth as his ankle shifted. Snow slid from his coat in clumps. Elias wrapped one arm around his back and lifted with care, feeling how little weight there was beneath the layers. When they reached the truck, Maddox backed down from the seat to make room, then pressed his body against Amos's knees as Elias eased him inside. Amos looked at the dog through a fog of pain. "You again?" Maddox placed his muzzle near the old man's hand. "Yes, yes," Amos muttered. "I remember. The handsome judge." Elias shut the passenger door and came around to the driver's side. Inside the truck, heat rolled over them, smelling faintly of rubber mats, coffee, and wet wool. Amos shivered hard now that his body had permission to admit how cold it was. Elias turned the heater higher. "Tell me." Amos leaned his head back against the seat. For a moment, he looked too tired to speak. The snow outside moved across the windshield in long diagonal streaks. "I went south," Amos said finally. "There's a man at the flea market near Hawthorne Road. Sells old instruments. Not good ones, mind you. The kind with cracks and missing strings. My kind of orchestra." "You went to buy another violin." "Thought I might find something that could still make a noise if handled gently." His mouth twitched. "Same could be said for me." Elias waited. "I had the money in an envelope." Amos's hand moved toward his inner coat pocket, then stopped at the emptiness. "Kept it close. Didn't show anyone, or I thought I didn't." "What happened?" "Cut through the alley behind Larch Street because the wind was less rude there. Two men came from behind the bakery. One asked if I was the fiddle man." Amos closed his eyes. "Before I could decide whether that was a compliment, one of them shoved me. I went down. They took the envelope." "Only the envelope?" Amos opened his eyes. That was when the humor drained out of him. For the first time since Elias had found him, the old man looked not merely cold or hurt, but frightened by the shape of his own memory. "They didn't take the watch," Amos said softly. "Didn't take the case. Didn't even check my other pocket." Elias looked through the windshield at the white road ahead. No random thief worked that cleanly. "Did you see their faces?" "Scarves, hoods, night coming down." Amos swallowed. One smelled like fryer oil. Elias turned his head slightly. North Star Grill lived in fryer oil. Half the town probably did. Still, the detail lodged itself in him like a splinter. Amos gave another shiver, violent enough to make his teeth click. Elias took out his phone. There was one bar of service. He called the Brightpine clinic first. No answer. Then he tried the emergency line posted on the clinic door from memory. A woman picked up on the fourth ring. "Brightpine Medical Station, Crane speaking." "This is Elias Ward. I found an elderly man off Lake Road. Possible sprained or dislocated ankle. Exposure. Shivering hard, but alert." There was a pause. Then the woman's voice sharpened from routine to command. "How long outside?" Elias looked at Amos. "An hour," Amos said. Then, under Elias's stare, 2, perhaps 3, if time is feeling dramatic. 2 to 3 hours, Elias said. The woman inhaled. "Road to the clinic is blocked. Semi-jackknifed below the East Pass, and I've got 2 hypothermia cases already waiting on county transport. Are you close to shelter?" "My place is 10 minutes. "Get him warm, but not hot. Dry layers if you have them. No rubbing the limbs. Elevate the ankle. If there's deformity, don't try to set anything yourself. Check his toes every 15 minutes for color and sensation. Warm fluids if he can swallow. No alcohol? Amos lifted one weak finger. There goes my evening. The woman on the phone heard him. Tell Amos Whitaker that if he makes jokes instead of following instructions, I'll come out there and make him regret surviving. Amos blinked. Elias looked at him. She knows you. Everybody knows everybody, Amos muttered. It's how small towns punish the living. The woman's voice softened, but only by a fraction. Is that Amos? Put me on speaker. Elias did. Amos, Nurse Lydia Crane said, You listen to Mr. Ward. I'll come by if the road opens before morning. If not, he brings you in at first light. You understand me? Yes, ma'am. The answer came automatically. Military, Elias thought. Not the words. The surrender to a competent voice. Good, Lydia said. And Elias? Yes? Don't let him walk out because he starts feeling ashamed. The line crackled, then died. For a while, neither man spoke. The truck rolled through the trees toward Morrow Lake. Darkness gathered early under the pines, but the snow on the ground held what was left of the day and gave it back faintly. Elias could feel the shape of Amos's silence beside him. Shame had a temperature. It could make a heated cab feel cold. My place isn't much, Elias said. Amos kept his eyes on the windshield. If it has a roof and no one yelling about business, it's a palace. It has a dog who snores. Maddox, sitting behind them now, gave a soft huff as if offended. Amos turned his head slowly. I withdraw my complaint. The cabin stood above Morrow Lake, half hidden by dark pines and a slope of untouched snow. Light from the porch fell in a pale rectangle across the steps. The lake beyond was frozen along the edges, its surface dark under the evening sky. Elias helped Amos inside. Warmth met them, wood smoke and clean cedar. The cabin was orderly to the point of austerity. A cast-iron stove burned near the stone wall. 2 chairs faced it. Work gloves lay squared on a bench by the door. Tools hung in careful rows. On a side table, a framed photograph lay face down, its back gathering dust. Amos noticed it. Of course he did. Men who had lost things could always see the covered shapes in another man's house. He said nothing. Maddox made one slow circuit of the room as if reminding the walls they had company, then returned to Amos and sat beside him. Elias eased the old man into the chair nearest the stove. He brought towels, dry socks, a wool blanket, and an old thermal shirt. Amos protested each item until his hands shook too badly to fold the blanket himself. You take in strays often? Amos asked, as Elias knelt to examine the ankle. Only when they're blocking traffic. Ah, public service. The ankle was badly swollen but not obviously deformed. Elias wrapped it firmly, then elevated it on a low stool. When he pushed back the cuff of Amos's sleeve to check his circulation, he saw it. A faded tattoo on the inside of the old man's wrist. The eagle, globe, and anchor had blurred with age, the line softened by years of sun and cold, but it remained unmistakable. Not decoration, not nostalgia. A brand of belonging from a life that did not easily release its men. Elias's hands paused for less than a second. Amos noticed anyway. The old man pulled the sleeve down, not sharply, but with quiet finality. Long time ago, he said. Elias secured the bandage. Some things are. Maddox rested his head on Amos's knee. Amos looked down at him, and whatever answer he had prepared dissolved. His fingers moved slowly into the shepherd's fur. The dog closed his eyes. The stove popped softly. Outside, the wind moved along the cabin wall. Snow pressed white against the lower window panes, but beyond them the frozen lake held a faint glow under the clouds, as if the world still had light stored somewhere beneath the ice. Elias stood and added another split log to the fire. He wanted to ask about the tattoo. He wanted to ask who had taken the money. He wanted to ask why a man who once wore that emblem had ended up sleeping under porches while a town learned to step around him. Instead, he filled the kettle. Some questions deserved warmth before they deserved answers. Amos leaned back in the chair, exhausted now, one hand still buried in Maddox's fur. The old man's eyelids lowered, then opened again. "I'll be gone in the morning," he said. Elias did not look at him. "Road may still be closed." "I don't want to trouble you." "You already did." Amos blinked. Elias set 2 mugs on the counter. "Might as well make it worthwhile." For a moment Amos stared at him. Then he laughed. It was small and cracked, but it belonged to the room, not outside it, not beyond glass. Inside. Maddox's tail thumped once against the floor. Elias poured the tea and listened to the wind worry the trees. Across from him sat an old Marine who had not yet admitted he was one, a man robbed of money meant for a broken instrument, a man whose pride still stood guard long after his body had begun to fail. 2 soldiers from different wars, 1 cabin, 1 dog lying between them like a treaty. Neither man had signed, but both had already begun to honor. Outside, snow kept falling over Morrow Lake, bright even in darkness. Inside, neither man spoke the truth aloud. Not yet. But for the first time since Elias had carried Amos from the roadside, the old man stopped looking toward the door. The storm did not leave Brightpine all at once. It settled in like an old creditor. For 3 days, snow moved over the town in long white sheets, erasing fences, narrowing roads, softening rooftops, until even the hard edges of North Star Grill and the municipal building looked forgiven. The pines around Morrow Lake bent under the weight. The lake itself vanished beneath a skin of gray-white ice and drifting powder, as if the world beyond Elias Ward's cabin had been folded away and stored somewhere unreachable. Inside, time changed shape. There was the stove to feed, the kettle to fill, the ankle to check, the windows to clear from the inside when frost thickened across the glass. There were small sounds Elias had not heard in his house for years. Another person coughing in the morning, a chair scraping near the fire, a muttered complaint about where the spoons were kept. Amos Whitaker proved to be a difficult patient in the specific way proud old men often were. He accepted help only after trying to make it look like a trade. By the second morning, Elias found him standing on 1 foot near the sink, peeling potatoes with the seriousness of a man defusing a bomb. "You're supposed to stay off that ankle," Elias said from the doorway. Amos did not look up. His silver hair, loosely tied back with a strip of cloth, had escaped in several directions. He wore one of Elias's old thermal shirts beneath his patched gray coat, which he still refused to fully remove, as if hospitality were a weather condition that might turn against him. "I am staying off it," Amos said. "See, this one's doing all the work." Maddox, lying near the stove, lifted his head. The shepherd gave 1 low sound. Not a threat. A correction. Amos pointed the potato peeler at him. "You stay out of this, officer." Maddox stood, crossed the room, and planted himself between Amos and the sink. Elias folded his arms. "He outranks you." "In what army?" "The one currently keeping you from falling into my cabinets." Amos glared at the dog, then at Elias, then surrendered with as much dignity as a man could manage while being herded by 80 pounds of German shepherd. He limped back to the chair near the stove and lowered himself into it with a hiss he tried to hide inside a cough. "You 2 run a strict boarding house," he said. "We have standards. Terrible ones, no music, no curtains worth mentioning, coffee strong enough to remove paint." Elias took the potato peeler from the counter. "You staying means you get to complain?" "No," Amos said. "Complaining means I'm recovering." That was how they moved through the first days, Not with confessions, not with gratitude, but with small arguments that built a safer bridge than kindness spoken too directly. Nurse Lydia Crane arrived late on the second morning when the road finally opened enough for her aging Subaru to crawl up the lake road. She came in without waiting to be fussed over, a sturdy woman in a burgundy winter coat with snow packed around her boots and a brown leather medical bag knocking against her hip. Her gray-streaked hair was pinned low, but the wind had loosened wisps around her cheeks. She looked like someone who could take a pulse, split firewood, and shame a town council in the same afternoon. "Where is he?" she asked. Amos raised one hand from the chair. "If you mean the tragic burden upon this household, present?" Lydia stopped in front of him and looked him over with the stern tenderness of someone who had spent too many years patching up people who apologized for bleeding. "You look worse than the last time I saw you." "You say that every time. And every time you treat it like a goal." She knelt to examine his ankle. Her hands were careful, but her eyes missed nothing. The swelling, the bruising, the way Amos tightened his jaw when she touched the outside of the joint. "Not broken," she said finally. "Bad sprain, maybe a mild dislocation that shifted back. You were shoved or twisted hard." Amos looked at the floor. Elias noticed that. Lydia did too. She wrapped the ankle again, better than Elias had, then gave him instructions with the authority of a small weather system. Rest, elevation, no wandering, no heroic nonsense, no just stepping out for air until she said so. At the door, she paused beside Elias. "He won't tell you everything," Lydia said quietly. "I guessed." "He used to come into town with repair work, fixed old mandolins, church guitars, anything with strings." Then he stopped. People made up reasons because real ones are less comfortable. Elias glanced toward Amos, who was pretending not to listen. Lydia lowered her voice further. "Don't push him too fast. Shame makes people run even when their legs don't work." Then she left, red coat vanishing into the white morning like a warning flag carried by the wind. That evening, the power went out. The cabin fell into stovelight and shadow. Elias lit 2 oil lamps and set one on the table, one near the hearth. The room softened. The tools on the wall lost their hard shapes. The face-down photograph on the side table became a rectangle of darkness. Snow ticked softly against the windows. Somewhere in the chimney the wind hummed. Amos sat with his bad foot propped up, the broken violin case beside his chair. He had not opened it since arriving. Maddox lay near the case as if guarding it from the silence. Elias poured coffee, then remembered Lydia's warning about strong coffee and replaced Amos's cup with tea. Amos eyed it. "I see I've been downgraded to leaf water." "Doctor's orders." "She's a nurse." "She scares me more than most doctors." That earned a brief smile. Then Amos leaned down and touched the violin case with 2 fingers. The gesture was so small, Elias almost looked away, as a man looks away from prayer. "His name was Julian Cross," Amos said. Elias stayed still. Amos did not open the case yet. His hand remained on the lid. He had no business being in the Marines, if you judged by first impressions. Too gentle-looking, long fingers, read poetry when the rest of us played cards, could make instant coffee taste worse by talking about the soul while drinking it. His mouth bent slightly. He carried that violin in a hard case wrapped with duct tape. Said if the world was determined to be loud and ugly, a man had a duty to smuggle in something better. The cabin seemed to listen with them. Elias sat across from him but did not interrupt. "We were logistics," Amos continued. "People think that means safe. Mostly it means everyone needs you, no one sees you, and the road still explodes under your tires if it feels like it." His voice stayed level, but the old humor had thinned. Julian played after bad days, not for ceremony, not for officers. Just outside the tent sometimes, sitting on an ammo crate like a fool, playing to men too tired to admit they needed it. I hated it at first. Why? Because it worked. Elias looked at him then. Amos's eyes were on the stove, but he seemed to be seeing a different fire. You spend enough time trying to become stone, and then some idiot plays a song your mother used to hum when you were 6. Suddenly you're not stone. You're a man with a face and a name and a place you might never see again. Maddox shifted, resting his muzzle on the edge of the violin case. Amos finally opened it. The broken instrument lay inside, wrapped in an old scarf. Even damaged, it looked strangely intimate, like something sleeping after injury. One side of the body was split where it had struck the stone step outside North Star Grill. Strings curled loose. The bridge had come away. The varnish, once warm brown, was scratched and dulled by years of weather and handling. Amos touched the cracked wood with the backs of his fingers. "He died before dawn," he said. No thunder, no dramatic shift, only the stove popping softly as if the room had swallowed a coal. Ambush on a road we'd driven twice that week. Smoke, noise, men shouting at God and each other like either one could answer fast enough. Julian was beside me in the truck before it happened. Afterward, he wasn't. Elias closed his eyes for half a second. He had never known Julian Cross, yet he knew the shape of that sentence. Before, afterward, every war taught men to divide time with words too small for what they carried. "His case survived," Amos said. "Can you believe that? Truck burned enough to blacken the frame, but the case had been thrown clear. Violin inside with one cracked rib. The chaplain asked if I wanted it sent home with his things. And you kept it. His sister said he'd want somebody to play it." Amos laughed softly, but there was no humor now. Poor woman had faith beyond reason. I told her I didn't know how. She said, "Then learn badly until you learn better." For a while, neither man spoke. The wind rose against the cabin and moved on. Amos drew the old scarf over the broken instrument again, but not before Elias saw something tucked beneath the lining of the case. A faded photograph. 2 young Marines stood near a dusty vehicle, one narrow-faced and smiling with a violin bow held like a sword, the other broader, squinting, embarrassed by the camera. Amos noticed Elias seeing it. This time he did not hide it. "That was him," he said. Elias nodded. "He looks like trouble." "The worst kind. Hopeful." The word lingered. Hopeful. In Elias's house, it sounded almost foreign. Later, after Amos slept in the chair despite insisting he was only resting strategically, Elias stood at the counter and washed the 2 mugs. His phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a name he had not answered in weeks. Tom Rusk. SEAL Team, 6 retired. Elias dried his hand slowly. The phone buzzed again, then stopped. A voicemail notification appeared. He did not touch it. From the chair, Amos's eyes opened. For an old man who claimed to sleep like a collapsed barn, he missed very little. "Friend?" Amos asked. Elias turned the phone face down. "Was? That a military answer or a sad one?" Elias looked at him. Amos lifted one hand, harmlessly. "Old men ask rude questions. It's how we check if we're still alive." Elias leaned against the counter. The lamplight caught the silver at his temples, the hard line of his clean jaw, the tiredness beneath the discipline. "Some missions end on paper," he said. "They don't always end in your head." Amos studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Not sympathy, recognition. "That's true," Amos said. "Paper has always been too thin for the heavy things." The phone remained face down between them like another closed case. Over the next 2 days, the pressure from town arrived not as a storm, but as weather reports. Brent called to move Elias to a later shift. Then another call came cutting that shift entirely. An email followed, polite and hollow, warning him about workplace conduct concerns and maintaining positive relations with community partners. Elias read it at the table, while Amos pretended to mend a torn curtain tie. "Community partners," Amos said. "That sounds like a phrase men use right before stealing something." Elias closed the laptop. "You know the Pruitts?" Amos's hand slowed. "Everybody knows the Pruitts." "That wasn't my question." "No," Amos said quietly. "It wasn't." The old man tied the thread off too tight and snapped it. That answer told Elias more than a direct one would have. By the fourth evening, the storm began to loosen. Power returned just before dusk, but neither man turned on the overhead lights. They had grown used to the softer room. Amos sat near the stove with the broken bow across his lap. Elias had been repairing a loose hinge on a cabinet, mostly for something to do. Maddox lay on his side, paws twitching in a dream. Without warning, Amos lifted the bow and drew a single strand of loose horsehair across the edge of a split piece of firewood. The sound was awful. A thin, strangled squeal shot through the cabin like a mouse being elected mayor. Maddox's head snapped up. Elias froze with the screwdriver in his hand. Amos stared at the wood, then at the bow. "Well," he said gravely, "Julian would have shot me." Elias tried not to laugh. Failed. It came out rough and surprised, so unfamiliar in the cabin that Maddox looked at him first, then at Amos, as if trying to identify the emergency. Amos's face cracked open into a grin. He tried another note, worse than the first. This time Elias laughed fully, one hand braced against the cabinet door. The sound filled the room awkwardly, like furniture being moved after years in one place. Maddox rose, circled twice, and sat in front of Amos with his head tilted so far, one ear nearly folded inside out. Amos laughed too, not politely, not defensively. He laughed until the bow dropped into his lap, and he pressed one hand over his eyes. Then the laughter broke. It did not become sobbing. Amos was too old, too trained, too stubborn for that kind of surrender. But his shoulders shook once, and when he lowered his hand, his eyes were wet. "I forgot," he whispered. Elias said nothing. Amos looked at the broken bow, the useless firewood, the dog sitting in solemn confusion before him. "I forgot I could still make a sound." The room became very quiet, not empty quiet, listening quiet. Elias set the screwdriver down. Maddox moved forward and placed his head on Amos's knee, as if endorsing the terrible music with full authority. Outside, the snow had stopped at last. The clouds thinned over Morrow Lake, and a pale wash of moonlight spread across the frozen surface. Inside the cabin, the old violin remained broken in its case. The man who had carried it was not whole either. But for the first time since Elias had met him, Amos Whitaker was not holding his silence like a punishment. He held the bow instead. And though it could barely make music, it was enough to remind the room that something in him had not yet been taken. The snow stopped before the wind did. By the fifth morning, Brightpine looked newly washed beneath a hard blue sky. Roof lines glittered. Icicles hung from porch rails like glass teeth. The sidewalks had been shoveled into narrow white corridors, and Main Street wore its winter charm with almost theatrical innocence. That was the thing about towns like Brightpine. They could look pure while keeping old dirt packed beneath the snow. Elias drove into town after making sure Amos had tea, breakfast, and his ankle elevated on the stool near the stove. Amos had protested all three items, naturally. He claimed tea was hot-leaf gossip, breakfast was an interruption, and the elevated ankle made him look like a retired duke waiting for tribute. Maddox had ended the debate by placing one heavy paw on the edge of the blanket and staring at Amos until the old Marine muttered, "Fine, Your Honor." Elias left them both with the stove burning low and drove toward Larch Street. He did not think of it as an investigation. He had no badge, no authority, and no desire to play sheriff in a town that already had too many men pretending power was the same thing as justice. He was only following the places where the story snagged. Amos had been shoved in the alley behind Larch Street. 2 men had taken only the envelope. 1 had smelled like fryer oil. Those were not conclusions. They were footprints. The alley was half cleared, a narrow strip between the bakery and the back wall of a closed hardware store. Snow had drifted into the corners where the wind could not reach. Elias parked near the loading door and let Maddox out on a short lead. The German shepherd stepped into the alley without hurry. His black and gold coat caught the morning light, and his scarred ear tilted as he lowered his nose toward the snow. He was not a magic trick. Elias knew that. Dogs noticed what men ignored, because dogs had no pride invested in pretending the world was clean. Near the bakery's grease bin, Maddox stopped. He pressed his nose to a crust of snow caught beneath a warped wooden pallet. Elias crouched and brushed away the top layer with his glove. A torn scrap of paper stuck to the ice. A receipt. Most of the ink had blurred, but the blue star printed at the top remained visible. North Star Grill. Elias studied it for a long moment. It proved almost nothing. Half the town ate there. A receipt in an alley was not a confession, but the scrap was folded into a small square, the kind someone might drop from a coat pocket while moving fast. Maddox sniffed again, then looked toward the mouth of the alley where the street opened bright and ordinary. Elias tucked the receipt into a plastic bag he kept in the truck for bolts and small parts. "Not enough," he said quietly. Maddox looked up at him. "No," Elias added, "but it's something." At the far end of Larch Street, the Brightpine Public Library sat behind 2 snow-laden maples, a brick building with green shutters and a brass return slot polished by decades of mittened hands. It was warmer inside than Elias expected, not just heated, but alive. Radiators hissed beneath the windows. A few elderly men read newspapers near the front. Someone had set out a tray of cinnamon cookies beside the checkout desk. Behind that desk stood Mara Whitcomb, arranging a stack of returned books as if each one had personally tested her patience. She glanced up over narrow reading glasses when Elias entered. "Elias Ward," she said. "Either you've finally come to return the emergency carpentry manual you borrowed last March, or something has gone wrong." Elias paused. "You remember that?" "I remember everything people hope I won't." Mara was 48, though she had the alert energy of someone too busy to age on schedule. Her brown hair was cut short at her jaw, one side tucked behind her ear with a pencil. A cream-colored scarf looped around her neck, and her cardigan sleeves were pushed up as if paperwork were physical labor. Her eyes moved fast. Elias, Maddox, the snow on his boots, the sealed plastic bag in his hand. "Maddox is allowed in," she added, before he asked. "He behaves better than the chess club." At the word allowed, Maddox sat. Mara looked at him. "Show off." Elias held out the bag. "I need to ask about Amos Whitaker." The change in Mara's expression was small, but Elias saw it. Her mouth tightened. Not surprise. Recognition. She took the bag, but did not open it yet. "What happened?" Elias told her only what mattered. The violin, Dalton, the money, the alley Amos found by the road. Mara listened without interrupting, which somehow made her feel less like a librarian and more like a locked filing cabinet deciding whether to open. When he finished, she walked to the front door, turned the sign from open to back in 10 minutes, and gestured toward a side room. "Bring the dog," she said. The side room smelled of paper, dust, lemon cleaner, and old radiator heat. Boxes lined one wall. A computer sat on a desk beneath a bulletin board covered with notices. Tax assistance, veterans benefits appointments, heating grant deadlines, grief support, snow removal volunteers. Mara opened a drawer and pulled out a thin file. "I've seen Amos's name," she said. "Not enough to understand it. Enough to be bothered." She laid documents on the table. Elias remained standing at first. Maddox settled beside his boot, head resting on his paws, eyes following Mara's hands. There were property tax notices, a deed transfer request, a temporary asset protection agreement, several letters from something called Brightpine Community Renewal Partnership. The name looked harmless. That made Elias dislike it immediately. Mara tapped the letterhead. This group started as a housing improvement program. Officially, it helps seniors and low-income residents handle repairs, tax arrears, winterization, things like that. On paper, very noble. "On paper," Elias repeated. "Paper is where polite people hide knives." She said it so flatly that Elias looked at her. Mara slid another page toward him. Amos owned a small house on Juniper Row. Nothing fancy. One floor, blue trim, old maple out front. His wife died years ago. After that, he got by on veteran benefits, repair jobs, odd work. Then the roof started leaking, taxes fell behind, and someone from the renewal partnership stepped in. Someone? People rarely sign the ugly parts themselves. Mara leaned over the page. Advisors, coordinators, community liaisons, titles soft enough to sleep on. Elias read the agreement. The words were clean, patient, and poisonous. Temporary stewardship, stabilization fees, emergency maintenance reimbursement, protective line structure. A maze built from velvet rope. "He signed this?" Elias asked. Mara's face hardened. "Yes? Did he understand it?" "That depends on whether you think understanding means being 77, grieving, broke, embarrassed, and sitting across from two well-dressed people, telling you they're the only thing between you and losing your home." Outside the window, someone laughed on the sidewalk. The sound came through faintly, as if from another town. Elias turned another page. His eyes stopped on one name, Gideon Pruitt. Not as owner. Not so obvious. His signature sat on an advisory board acknowledgement, elegant and spare, with a note thanking the partnership for preserving Brightpine's historic dignity. Elias felt a cold different from weather move through him. "Dalton's father," he said. Mara nodded. "Chair of the town council, patron of the winter festival, friend of every contractor who wants municipal work. Speaks beautifully about community." "That why my hours disappeared?" "Probably." Mara did not soften it. "Gideon doesn't need to yell. He just makes the air thinner around people who displease him." Elias looked down at the papers again. He had dealt with men like Gideon before, though in different uniforms and different rooms. Men who could use language the way others used wire. Men who never touched the victim because touching left marks. Mara opened another file. After Amos pushed back, rumors started. She pulled a small notebook from the stack. He was drinking. He was confused. He sold the house voluntarily. He became unstable. He harassed customers with that violin. You know the kind of story people repeat because it lets them stop feeling guilty. Elias did. That was what angered him most, not only the taking, the rewriting afterward. It was never enough to steal a man's roof. The thief had to steal the explanation, too. "Does the town know he was a Marine?" Elias asked. "Some do." Mara's voice lowered. "Some pretend they don't. Some say it was a long time ago, as if service expires when a man gets inconvenient." The room seemed smaller then. Elias thought of Amos at the stove, one hand in Maddox's fur, laughing at his own pain before anyone else could name it. He thought of the broken violin wrapped in an old scarf. He thought of Julian Cross, whose memory had somehow been left to survive in a cracked instrument and an old man's stubborn hands. Mara watched his face. "You want to fix this," she said. "I want to know what happened." "That's safer." She gathered the documents back into a square pile. But not by much. Elias reached for the file. "Can I copy these?" "You can look at copies." Mara pulled the file just out of reach. "The originals stay here, and before your jaw gets any more heroic, listen to me." He did. Mara pointed one finger at the papers. "This is not a diner doorway. You can't stand in front of Gideon Pruitt and shame him into doing the right thing. He is not Dalton. Dalton breaks things because he has feelings too large for his skull. Gideon removes people from their homes and calls it beautification." Elias said nothing. "You need witnesses," Mara continued. "Payment trails. People willing to say what was done to them. You need someone above the town who isn't afraid of losing a snowplow contract." "Do you know anyone like that?" "Maybe." She sat back. "But maybe doesn't help until Amos wants to stand up." The words landed harder than Elias expected, because Amos did not want that. Elias knew it before he even drove back to the cabin. Amos listened from the chair near the stove, while Elias explained what Mara had found. The old man had shaved badly that morning with one of Elias's razors, leaving a tiny nick near his jaw. It made him look less like a drifter and more like a grandfather preparing for something he did not want to attend. The broken violin case sat beside him. Maddox lay on the rug between them. When Elias mentioned Juniper Row, Amos's eyes went toward the window. "That house is gone," he said. "Not gone. Taken." "Same result." "No." Amos looked at him then, and his face had closed in a way Elias had not seen since the roadside. "You think words change it?" "I think the right ones on the right papers might." Amos gave a tired laugh. "That's a young man's faith." "I'm 51. "Exactly." Elias let that pass. He spread Mara's copies on the table. Amos did not look at them. His hands remained folded over the blanket on his lap, knuckles raised, skin thin and cracked. "They used fees," Elias said. "Liens, transfer agreements, the renewal partnership." "I know what they used." The sharpness in Amos's voice made Maddox lift his head. Silence followed. Amos breathed through his nose, slow and uneven. "I was there," he said. "I remember the table. I remember the woman's perfume. Lavender. Too much of it. I remember her saying my wife would want me to be practical. Imagine that, a stranger using my dead wife to sell me my own ruin." Elias stayed still. "They told me I was behind, but not beyond saving." That was the phrase, not beyond saving. Amos looked at the stove. "A man hears that at the wrong time, he'll sign almost anything." The fire snapped. "I thought they were helping me hold on," Amos whispered. "Turns out they were just measuring the rooms before carrying me out." Elias had no answer good enough. Maddox rose, walked to the corner where the violin case had been kept earlier, and nosed the small wooden box Elias had made from scrap to hold the broken pieces safely. The box slid across the floor with a dry scrape. "Maddox," Elias said softly, but the dog nudged it again until it rested near Amos's boot. Amos stared down at it. The lid was not fancy. Elias had cut and sanded the boards during a sleepless hour before dawn, making something plain but careful. Inside lay the fragments Amos had not known where to put: a splintered curve of varnished wood, 2 loose pegs, the broken bridge, a coil of string. For the first time since Elias began talking about the house, Amos reached for something. Not the papers. The box. He lifted the lid and touched the broken bridge with one finger. "That belonged to Julian before it belonged to me," he said. "I know." "No," Amos said. "You know a story. That's not the same." The correction was not cruel. It was true. Amos drew a breath that seemed to scrape against years. "I don't want that house back so I can sit in it and count my losses," he said. "I don't even know if I could sleep there now. But they took it and then told the town I threw it away. They took his song and called it noise. They took my name and replaced it with rumors." His hand closed around the broken bridge. "That part," he said quietly, "I may not be finished with." Elias felt the room shift, not dramatically, not like victory, more like ice cracking somewhere far below the surface. Mara had said Amos needed to want to stand up. This was not standing, but it was no longer lying down. Elias sat across from him. "Then we start small." Amos looked suspicious. "Small how?" "We find what happened. We don't accuse what we can't prove. We don't hand them a reason to call you unstable. We talk to Mara again. Maybe Lydia. Anyone who saw the same pattern." "And if no one talks?" Elias looked at the box of broken violin pieces between them. "Then we keep listening." A little humor returned to Amos's face, weary but real. "That sounds dangerously poetic for a man who alphabetizes his wrenches." "They're sorted by size." "Worse." Maddox laid down beside Amos's chair, his head near the wooden box. The old Marine lowered his hand into the dog's fur. For a while they sat like that, with the copied papers spread across the table and the broken instrument resting at Amos's feet. Outside, the afternoon sun struck the snow on Morrow Lake so brightly that the whole cabin filled with pale winter light. Brightpine looked beautiful beyond the windows. That beauty no longer felt innocent. Somewhere in town, Gideon Pruitt's name sat on polite letters and clean agreements. Somewhere, Dalton was probably still pouring coffee beneath warm lights, wearing his family ring, telling himself the world had returned to its proper shape. But in Elias's cabin, an old man who had been turned into a rumor had touched the remains of his friend's violin and remembered that silence was not the same as peace. And for the first time, he did not ask when he should leave. The Pruitts did not strike like men in an alley. They struck like weather. First came a letter from the bridge contractor, written in the clean, bloodless language of people who wanted harm to arrive wearing a tie. Due to seasonal restructuring and changing project needs, Elias Ward's contract would be suspended indefinitely. No accusation, no explanation, no signature from anyone with courage enough to press hard on the pen. Elias read it at the kitchen table while Amos sat near the stove with his bad ankle propped on a stool. Morning light fell through the window in pale sheets. Maddox lay between them, his amber eyes moving from the paper to Elias's face. Amos lowered his cup of tea. "Suspended indefinitely," he said. "That's a fancy way to fire a man without admitting you own a knife." Elias folded the letter once and set it aside. "It's work. It's rent, food, fuel, pride." Elias looked at him. Amos shrugged, but the motion had less humor than usual. "I've misplaced all four at different times. I recognize the sound." The second strike came that afternoon. A yellow parking ticket appeared on Elias's truck, though it sat in the same patch of packed snow beside his cabin where it had sat for 2 winters. The third came in the form of a town notice taped to his porch door. Inspection required for unpermitted roof repairs. Elias stood on the steps with the paper in his hand while the lake wind moved over the trees. Maddox sniffed the notice, then sneezed. "Good review," Elias said. By evening, the fourth strike arrived through Owen Pike, who stopped by with a bag of welding rods Elias had left at the site. Owen did not come inside. He stood under the porch light, hat pulled low, shoulders hunched against the cold. "Dalton's been talking," Owen said. Elias waited. "Saying you took in that old man because you like playing hero. Saying Amos ain't no Marine. Just wears the story because folks tip better for a veteran than a bum." Behind Elias, something shifted. Amos had heard. The old man stood just inside the doorway, one hand braced against the wall, face gone so still it seemed carved from ash. Owen saw him and looked away immediately. "I'm sorry." Amos did not answer. He turned and limped back toward the stove. The door closed after Owen left, but the words stayed inside. Elias found Amos by the window, staring out at the frozen lake. The old man's hands were curled at his sides. His face showed no tears, no visible wound, and somehow that made the damage worse. "They can call me drunk," Amos said quietly. "They can call me broke. They can call me crazy if it helps them sleep." He swallowed. "But not that." Elias said nothing. Amos's voice thinned. "Not that." Maddox came to stand beside him. The shepherd did not press close this time. He simply stood shoulder to knee, present without asking. That night, Elias put on his coat. He did it without announcing his decision. The movement was deliberate. Boots, gloves, truck keys from the hook near the door. His face had gone calm, in the old way, the dangerous way, emptied of everything unnecessary. Amos noticed first. "Where are you going?" Elias reached for the door. Maddox moved faster. The German shepherd stepped between Elias and the exit, broad chest filling the narrow space. He did not growl. He did not bark. He only looked up at Elias with the steady, unblinking stare of an animal who knew the difference between courage and a trap. "Maddox?" Elias said. The dog did not move. For several seconds, man and dog stood facing one another in the low firelight. Then Elias saw it, not Dalton's face, not the diner, not even Amos's pain. He saw what Dalton would see if Elias walked into North Star Grill, angry enough to make the room silent. A former Navy SEAL, towering over a local business owner, hands clenched, voice low. One witness with a phone, one clipped angle, one rumor sharpened into proof. Pruitt would not need to beat him. Elias would have handed them the shape of the story. He let the keys hang from his fingers. Amos spoke behind him, rough but steady. "Dog's smarter than both of us." Elias looked down at Maddox. The shepherd blinked once. Slowly, Elias placed the keys back on the hook. The decision cost him more than motion would have. By noon the next day, Mara Whitcomb had turned the library's back room into something halfway between a town meeting and a confession booth. She did not call it an investigation. She wrote, "Veterans and Senior Housing Support Discussion" on a whiteboard outside the room in neat blue marker. Beneath it, in smaller letters, she added, "Coffee available. No speeches required." "That last part matters," she told Elias as she arranged chairs in a loose circle. "People don't come to be saved. They come to see whether the floor holds." The room was small, warmed by yellow lamps, and the old radiator ticking beneath the window. Shelves of local history books lined one wall. Snow fell outside in light. Harmless flakes, the pretty kind sold on postcards. Its beauty made the empty chairs feel almost accusing. Amos sat near the back with his mended ankle wrapped and his scarf tucked close. He had insisted on coming, then insisted he would not speak, then insisted Elias not make that face. What face? "The one where your eyebrows try to enlist me." Maddox lay beside Amos's chair, his head near the old man's boot. Nurse Lydia arrived next, carrying her brown medical bag and a folder stuffed with notes. She wore her burgundy coat open over a teal sweater, cheeks red from the cold. "I am not here officially," she told Mara. Mara handed her a cup of coffee. "Naturally. I mean it. Of course. I brought records," I assumed. Lydia narrowed her eyes. "You're irritating. I've been told it's my ministry." For the first 20 minutes, no one else came. Elias stood near the window, arms folded, watching the sidewalk. He told himself this was expected. Fear did not travel fast in small towns. It crept, checked both ways, turned back twice, then arrived late with excuses. Amos stared at the empty chairs as if each one had confirmed something he already believed. Then the door opened. A woman stepped in wearing a purple knit hat and a coat too thin for January. She was in her 60s, round-faced, with nervous hands and a grocery tote clutched against her chest. "I'm just here for the coffee," she said. Mara nodded. "Best reason." The woman sat by the door. 5 minutes later, an older man came in leaning on a cane carved from dark wood. His shoulders were still wide beneath his worn barn coat, but his knees had surrendered years ago. He nodded to no one and sat where he could see the exit. Then came a man with spectacles and a hearing aid, the former owner of Brightpine's watch repair shop, which now sold imported candles to tourists. He brought his own notebook, as if afraid the room might forget him. More followed slowly. Not many. Enough. No one introduced themselves as victims. They introduced themselves by what they used to own, what they used to fix, where they used to live, who they used to be before paperwork made them smaller. Mara began simply. No one has to share more than they want. No one signs anything tonight. No one's story leaves this room without permission. Lydia added, and if anyone feels dizzy, tells me before falling over. I am too old to catch pride and body weight at the same time. A few people laughed. The sound helped. The woman in the purple hat spoke first. Her name was Eileen Mercer. Her husband had died in March. By April, a man from a community renewal office had offered to help her handle heating bills and funeral debt. By August, she had signed documents she still did not understand. By November, her late husband's workshop had been sold. He called me Mrs. Mercer every time, she said, eyes fixed on her tote bag. Made me feel respectable. I should have known better. You were grieving, Lydia said. Eileen shook her head. That's the same thing people say when they mean foolish. No? Amos said from the back. Every head turned. He looked startled by his own voice, but he continued. No, ma'am. Foolish is buying canned peaches in winter and expecting them to taste like July. He glanced down at his hands. Trusting someone who studied your sorrow before knocking on your door. That's different. Eileen's eyes filled. She did not cry, but she breathed differently after that. One by one, the stories unfolded. Not identical. Worse than identical. Similar enough to show design, different enough to prove the design had been customized to each wound. A retired miner named Cal Hobb had signed after being told his furnace repairs would be covered before the first freeze. The watch repairman, Mr. Nellis, had signed after a liaison promised to help preserve his business and then declared the building financially unsustainable. Lydia read from her notes about older residents who declined fast after losing heat, mobility, routine, or dignity. She did not accuse, she named dates. Dates had a weight rumors hated. Then the door opened again. A younger man stepped in and nearly stepped back out. Rory Vale wore a black puffer jacket too thin at the elbows, a brown hoodie underneath, and the expression of someone who had come to the wrong funeral but recognized the body. His curly hair stuck out from under a knit cap. His hands stayed buried in his pockets, one thumb flicking at something inside. Elias had seen him at North Star Grill, moving between the kitchen and the counter with his eyes lowered. Mara looked at him. Rory, I can leave, he said immediately. No one asked you to. Rory glanced at Amos. That glance said too much. Amos saw it. So did Elias. Rory took a chair near the door and spent the next 10 minutes staring at the floor. When Mara asked if anyone else wanted to speak, Rory's mouth opened, then closed. His right hand came out of his pocket holding a cheap blue lighter. He flicked it once. No flame. Just the click. 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 Elias watched him. Rory noticed and stopped. I only heard things, Rory said finally. The room stilled. Mara's voice was gentle in a way that did not weaken it. What kind of things? Rory swallowed. At the grill. Dalton was mad after the violin thing. Said the old man made him look like a fool. Said Mr. Ward made him look worse. Amos looked down at Maddox. Rory flicked the lighter again, then gripped it hard. I told him about the envelope. I didn't think. His voice broke off. Amos lifted his eyes. Rory could not meet them. I saw the money, Rory said, when Mr. Ward gave it to you. Later, Dalton asked if you really had that much. I said, yeah. That's all I said. No one moved. That's all I said, Rory repeated. But now it sounded like a plea he did not believe. Lydia's face had hardened. Elias asked, did Dalton send someone after him? Rory shook his head too quickly. I didn't hear that. Rory, I didn't hear that, he whispered. But two guys were in the kitchen alley later, Tate and Len. They do odd jobs. Dalton told them the fiddle man had cash and wouldn't call cops because nobody would listen to him anyway. The air left the room slowly. Amos sat very still. Rory's eyes were wet with panic. "I didn't go. I swear I didn't touch him." "No," Amos said. Rory looked up. The old man's voice was quiet. "You just pointed." Rory flinched as if struck. Before anyone could answer, Maddox rose. His head turned toward the window. The dog's body changed, not into aggression, but into alertness so precise it seemed to cut the room in half. Elias followed his gaze. Outside, beyond the glass, a shape moved near the snow-laden hedge. A phone screen glowed. Someone was taking pictures. Elias crossed the room in 3 strides and pushed open the side door. Cold air burst in. The figure ran. "Elias!" Mara shouted. He did not chase far. The snow was slick, and the person had a head start across the narrow lot behind the library. A dark coat vanished past the alley beside the post office. On the ground beneath the window, half buried in powder, lay a key. Elias picked it up with his gloved hand. A brass key on a plastic tag. The tag bore a blue star, North Star Grill. When Elias returned to the room, every face turned toward him. He held up the key. Rory went pale. Not nervous pale. Recognition pale. Mara saw it. "Rory." He shook his head. "I can't. You already started. They'll know." "They know now," Elias said. Rory stared at the key as if it were a small animal that had crawled from his own chest. Then he sat down hard. "I know whose key that is," he whispered. Mara did not push. Not yet. The room had taken in too much for one night, and fear, like frostbite, could worsen if warmed too fast. The meeting ended without applause, without promises. People left in 2s and 3s, pulling hats low, glancing down the street before stepping into the snow. But they did not leave the same way they had come. They carried something with them now, not courage exactly, but the first uncomfortable evidence that silence had neighbors. Amos remained seated after the others had gone. Maddox leaned against his leg. Elias waited by the door. Finally, Amos spoke without looking up. "Take me to Juniper Row." Mara glanced at Elias. His face gave nothing away, but she understood the request was not practical. It was ritual. The house on Juniper Row stood 3 blocks from the library beneath an old maple whose bare branches held snow like white ash. It was small, 1 story, pale blue trim dulled by winter, porch rail repaired in newer wood that did not match. A warm lamp glowed in the front room. Someone lived there now. Someone else's curtains hung in Amos Whitaker's windows. Elias parked across the street. For a moment, Amos did not move. Then he opened the truck door before Elias could come around, stubbornness returning like an old uniform. He leaned on his cane and crossed through the shallow snow with Maddox at his side, the dog adjusting his pace to the old man's uneven steps. Amos stopped at the fence. The cold brightened his eyes. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of varnished wood from the broken violin, the curved splinter he had carried since the night Dalton broke it. He held it in his palm, thumb moving once over the worn brown surface. "This was near the bridge," he said. Elias stood a few feet behind him. "The violin bridge?" Amos nodded. Julian used to say the bridge was the small thing that let the strings speak to the body. Without it, all you have is tension. He gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. "Smart man, annoying about it." Then Amos bent slowly, pain tightening his face, and placed the piece of wood at the foot of the fence. He did not touch the gate. He did not call out. He did not ask the house to recognize him. He only stood there beneath the maple tree, looking at what had been taken and what could not be taken. "Julian Cross," he whispered. The name moved into the cold air and stayed there. Elias lowered his head, not in prayer exactly, but in respect. Maddox sat beside Amos, his tail curled around his paws, watching the little house as if guarding a border no deed could define. After a long while, Amos straightened. His eyes were wet, but no tear fell. "This isn't goodbye," he said. Elias looked at him. Amos turned from the fence, slow but steadier than before. "It's notice." The three of them walked back to the truck through the quiet snow. Behind them, the splinter of violin wood remained at the fence like a small brown flame against the white. Mara Whitcomb did not send the files all at once. She was too careful for that. She copied, labeled, cross-checked, and arranged every paper as if the right order could make frightened people braver. Property notices in one folder, medical hardship claims in another, statements from the library meeting, Lydia Crane's notes, photographs of Amos's bruised ankle, a scan of the North Star grill key, a written account from Elias, stripped of anger until only facts remained. Then she sent the packet to the state. For 2 days, nothing happened. Brightpine carried on beneath its winter shine. Tourists bought maple candy on Main Street. The bakery hung paper snowflakes in its window. North Star Grill kept serving coffee beneath yellow lamps, and Dalton Pruitt stood behind the counter with his ringed hand resting near the register as if nothing in the world had shifted. But inside Elias Ward's cabin, the silence had a different weight. Amos sat near the stove with the broken violin case across his knees, pretending to study it as a repair problem and not a wound. Maddox lay beside him, chin on his paws, eyes half closed but always aware. On the third morning, a black state sedan rolled into Brightpine. The woman who stepped out did not look like anyone's savior. That, Elias decided, was probably in her favor. Celeste Warren wore a gray wool coat buttoned to the throat, low leather boots dusted with road salt, and no expression she did not mean to give away. She had straight black hair cut just below her jaw, brown eyes that moved quickly without seeming hurried, and a red folder tucked under one arm. When she entered the library, she shook Mara's hand, accepted coffee without drinking it, and asked for a room with a door that closed. Mara gave her the archive room. "Good choice," Celeste said, looking at the shelves of Old Town records. Rooms with memory make people less careless. By noon, Elias, Amos, Lydia, and Rory Vale were seated around a narrow table beneath fluorescent lights that hummed like tired insects. Rory looked worse than he had at the library meeting. His hoodie was wrinkled, his curls flattened on one side, and the cheap blue lighter sat on the table in front of him, though he did not touch it at first. He kept glancing toward the door as if expecting Dalton to walk through it wearing the whole town as armor. Celeste did not comfort him. She also did not threaten him. That made her more effective than both. "Mr. Vale," she said, opening the red folder, "I'm not here to decide whether you are a good person. I'm here to determine whether your statement can be supported." Rory swallowed. "I didn't hurt Mr. Whitaker." "No one asked you that yet." His face reddened. Amos sat very still at the end of the table. He wore his patched gray coat despite the room being warm. His scarf was tucked close at his throat. Maddox was not allowed in the archive room, but he waited outside the door, visible through the narrow window, ears lifted. Rory finally spoke. Not cleanly, not heroically. The truth came out of him in pieces, each one dragged over fear. He admitted seeing the envelope of money after Dalton paid Amos for the violin. He admitted Dalton asked how much was in it. He admitted 2 men, Tate Berenger and Len Cobb, had come through the kitchen entrance after closing. Dalton had not said the words, "rob him." He was smarter than that, even in anger. He had said, "Old Fiddleman's carrying cash tonight. Bet he won't call anyone if it disappears." Rory stared at the table. "I laughed," he whispered. "I didn't think they'd really—" He stopped. Amos looked at him, and Rory could not finish the lie. Celeste wrote without looking up. "You have messages?" Rory took out his phone with shaking hands. There were texts. Not confessions, but enough shape around the hole. Dalton asking if Tate and Len were around, a message about the alley behind Larch. Rory texting Dalton later, You didn't say they'd knock him down. Dalton replying, "Don't get soft now." Lydia made a sound under her breath that was almost a prayer and almost a curse. Celeste photographed the messages, logged the times, and asked Rory to sign a preliminary statement. His hand hovered over the pen. "If I do this," he said, "I can't go back there." Mara, standing by a shelf of old newspapers, answered before Celeste could. "No?" Rory looked at her. Her voice softened, but not enough to lie. "No, you probably can't." The truth frightened him. It also seemed to steady him. Rory signed. Amos watched the pen move across paper. His face did not forgive. Not yet, perhaps not ever. But something in him recognized the cost of that signature. When they left the library, Dalton was parked across the street in his camel wool coat, leaning against his truck. He smiled when he saw them. It was not a happy smile. It was a man showing teeth to remind the room, even outdoors, that he still had them. Rory froze. Elias stepped beside him, not in front of him. That mattered. Rory had to walk past with his own feet. Maddox, released from the library entrance, moved to Elias's left side. His body stayed calm, but his eyes remained fixed on Dalton. Dalton lifted 2 fingers in a lazy little salute. "Busy morning?" he called. Celeste looked at him once. Only once. Then she turned to Mara. "I'll need copies of the Renewal Partnership's public filings by 4. Dalton's smile thinned. For the first time, Elias saw it. Not fear exactly, but calculation losing its footing. That night, the retaliation came without Dalton's face attached. The temperature dropped hard after sunset. Elias had gone into town with Lydia to pick up medication for Amos and more bandages. Amos insisted he could manage the fire for 20 minutes. Elias refused. Amos argued. Maddox ended the matter by refusing to get into the truck, choosing instead to stay at the cabin. "You have been overruled by the hairy magistrate," Amos said. So Maddox stayed. When Elias returned, the porch light was out. At first he thought the bulb had died. Then Maddox barked from inside the cabin. Not once, 3 times. Deep, urgent, controlled. Elias moved fast. The side gate to the small woodshed hung open, swaying in the wind. The security light near the shed was dead. Snow had been kicked up along the path. The cord feeding power to the shed camera had been cut clean through. Inside, Amos stood frozen near the back door, one hand gripping the frame, his bad ankle half wrapped in a house slipper. Maddox stood in front of him, body blocking the threshold. "What happened?" Elias asked. Amos looked embarrassed, shaken, and angry all at once. "Fire dropped low. I thought I'd fetch a few logs. Door was open. I nearly stepped down." Elias looked past him. The bottom step had been iced deliberately. Someone had poured water over it and let the cold do the rest. A man with 2 good legs might have fallen hard. Amos, with his injured ankle, could have broken something worse. Maddox had stopped him. Elias crouched by the step, jaw tight. There were boot prints near the shed, already softening under new snow. The camera at the corner of the cabin had caught only a blur and a vehicle turning at the end of the lake road, but the plate was visible enough. Not complete. Enough for Celeste. Mara received the still image by email. Celeste matched the partial plate to a truck registered to Len Cobb's cousin, often seen parked behind North Star Grill. Rory confirmed the connection before midnight, voice trembling over the phone. The next morning, Celeste filed for a formal investigation into Brightpine Community Renewal Partnership and related municipal housing funds. By noon, Gideon Pruitt made a statement outside the town hall. He stood in a charcoal wool suit under a black overcoat, silver hair combed perfectly despite the wind. His voice, carried through a local reporter's phone, was smooth enough to frost glass. He called the concerns administrative misunderstandings. He praised transparency. He expressed sympathy for any resident experiencing confusion during difficult transitions. Amos watched the video from Elias's kitchen table. "Confusion?" he said. The word came out flat. Elias closed the laptop, but Brightpine had already begun to change. Eileen Mercer signed her statement. Cal Hobb signed his. Mr. Nellis came in with a shoebox full of old letters tied with twine. Lydia submitted dates and wellness notes. Mara kept the library open late, the lamps glowing while people who had spent months hiding papers in drawers brought them out like evidence from a battlefield. While the town's clean language began to crack, Amos carried the broken violin to Leonard Pike. Leonard's repair shop sat above a narrow music store that smelled of cedar, dust, and brass polish. Wind chimes hung in the stairwell, ringing softly whenever the door opened. Leonard himself was a small, bent man with round glasses, a white mustache, and hands so careful they seemed to belong to someone repairing birds. He took the violin from Amos without drama. No gasp, no pity. He laid it on a padded bench beneath a lamp and leaned close. "Well," Leonard said after a long inspection, "it has been insulted." Amos blinked. "Can it be fixed?" Leonard peered over his glasses. "That depends on what you mean by fixed." Elias stood near the door with Maddox, who was busy sniffing a shelf of rosin tins as if they might be edible. Leonard touched the cracked rib of the violin. "It won't be what it was. Wood remembers trauma. So do instruments. This split will leave a scar. The tone may be rougher, lower. It may complain in damp weather, as do I." Amos's mouth tightened. Leonard looked at him then, really looked. But rough is not dead. He lifted the broken bridge. Some instruments become interesting only after they stop pretending to be perfect. Amos gave a short breath. "You talk to all customers like this?" "Only the ones who bring me resurrection work?" For the first time all day, Elias saw the old Marine's shoulders lower. Over the next week, 2 kinds of repair happened in Brightpine. One involved documents, signatures, recorded statements, and Celeste Warren's red folders multiplying across Mara's archive table. The other involved glue warmed carefully, clamps set with patience, new strings stretched over old wood, and Leonard muttering at the violin as if arguing with a stubborn uncle. Amos visited the shop each afternoon, Kane tapping along the stairs. He never hovered too close. He pretended to inspect the ceiling, the window, a cracked mandolin on the wall. But his eyes always returned to the workbench. Elias saw that fear in him. Not fear that the violin could not be repaired. Fear that it could, because then Amos would have to play again. The idea came from Elias on a Friday evening, though later he would not be sure whether he invented it or merely said aloud what the room had been waiting for. They were in the cabin. The repaired violin had come home in its case, not whole, not beautiful in the old way, but breathing. A darker patch of varnish marked the crack. The new bridge was pale maple. The strings shone. Maddox lay beside it like a guard at a royal tomb. "What if you played at the church?" Elias asked. Amos looked at him as if he had suggested juggling knives on the roof. "No." "For the people signing statements. For the ones who came to the library. A small night, coffee, donations if people want to help with repairs, legal fees, emergency heat." "No, you haven't heard the whole idea." "I heard the dangerous part." Elias leaned back. "You don't have to be good. That is the cruelest encouragement I have ever received. You have to be there." Amos's hand moved toward the case, then stopped. "They'll come to stare," he said, "to see the old fool who got robbed twice, once in an alley and once with a pen." "Some might." "Thank you for the comfort." "Some will come because they need to see you standing." Amos looked away. Elias's voice lowered. "Julian Cross probably didn't need perfect music." The old man's face changed. "He might have needed to know you kept playing." Silence filled the room. Not the dead kind. The kind before a door opens. That night, Amos finally lifted the violin from its case. His hands shook so badly, Elias almost told him to wait. He did not. Pity would have snapped the moment in half. Amos tucked the instrument under his chin. The posture returned slowly, like an old password remembered by the body before the mind trusted it. He drew the bow across the strings. The note that came out was rough, low, unsteady. Maddox's scarred ear twitched, his head lifted. For one painful second, Amos froze. Then Maddox lowered his head again and stayed. The dog did not flee the sound. He accepted it. Amos tried another note, then a third. The melody was barely there, a candle behind fog, but it existed. His eyes filled. A laugh escaped him, broken at the edges. "Well," he whispered, looking at Maddox, "there's one audience member with poor taste." Maddox thumped his tail once against the floor. Elias stood in the kitchen doorway, unseen for a moment, and felt something loosen in his chest that no court order could have reached. Outside, Brightpine's winter lights shone through falling snow. Inside, the violin was scarred, the old Marine's hands were shaking, and the song sounded nothing like it had before. But it was no longer silent, and for that night, that was enough. The night of the gathering, snow returned to Brightpine softly. It did not storm, it did not punish the windows or bury the roads. It fell in slow, patient flakes over the little wooden church at the end of Maple Street, settling on the steps, the bell tower, and the bare branches of the elms, like dust from a kinder heaven. Inside, the church glowed. Yellow light spilled through stained glass and painted the snow outside in broken colors: blue, amber, red, green. The pews smelled faintly of old wood, wool coats, coffee, and the lemon polish someone had used too generously that afternoon. Folding tables stood along one wall with paper cups, a dented coffee urn, and 3 plates of cookies brought by women who insisted they were not coming to make a fuss, then came early anyway. Elias Ward stood near the back with Maddox at his side. He had worn his olive-drab combat shirt beneath a dark wool coat, the kind of clothing that let him be respectful without pretending to be someone else. He kept his hands loosely folded in front of him, eyes moving over the room by habit. Entrances, windows, faces, exits. Old habits did not vanish just because the music had changed. Maddox sat beside the aisle, his black and gold coat brushed clean, leather collar dark against his neck. His scarred ear tilted every time someone new stepped through the door. Several people looked down at him before choosing a seat, and more than one seemed to relax after the dog accepted them without complaint. The crowd was not large at first. Some came because guilt had finally grown heavier than staying home. Some came because they had signed papers of their own and wanted to see if their shame had company. Some came because Brightpine was small, and scandal had a way of ringing louder than the church bell. A few came hoping to watch the Pruitts fall. Elias could tell the difference. So could Mara Whitcomb. She stood near the front with a clipboard tucked under one arm, her cream scarf wrapped neatly over a dark dress. She had arranged the night with ruthless modesty. No banners, no stage lights, no dramatic title. On the church notice board outside, she had written only Community Winter Support Evening Music, Coffee, Housing Assistance. Information never frightened people with the truth before giving them coffee, she had said earlier. Nurse Lydia Crane stood near the side table, burgundy coat draped over a chair, medical bag still at her feet, because Lydia did not believe in being caught unprepared by either blood pressure or foolishness. She was speaking with Eileen Mercer, one hand warm on the woman's elbow. Celeste Warren sat halfway down the aisle, gray coat folded beside her, red folder resting on her lap. She watched without performing sympathy. She listened the way a locked door listens before deciding whether to open. At the back corner, Rory Vale had taken a seat alone. He looked smaller, without the noise of North Star Grill around him. His hair was combed badly, his hands locked together, the cheap blue lighter absent for once. He had not come to be forgiven. Elias respected that. Forgiveness demanded more time than one honest statement and one frightened signature. Amos Whitaker waited in the small room beside the altar. Elias had seen him only once that evening, before people began arriving. Amos had worn his old gray coat, cleaned and mended at the elbows by Lydia's neighbor, a retired seamstress who claimed she only did it because the sleeve offended her. His silver hair was tied back. The repaired violin rested in its case on the chair beside him. His hands had been shaking. "Still time to run," Amos had said. Elias had looked toward the snow outside. "Bad weather for it." "I've run in worse." "I know." That had ended the joke. For a moment, Amos had looked down at the violin case. "If I sound awful, you tell Julian it was the instrument." "You can tell him yourself someday." Amos had glanced up sharply. Elias had not smiled. "But not tonight." The old Marine had made a rough sound that might have been a laugh, then turned away before it could become anything softer. Now Mara stepped to the front. The room settled slowly, cough by cough, chair creak by chair creak. "Thank you for coming," Mara said. She did not raise her voice much. She did not have to. The room was ready to hear something. "This is not a court hearing. It is not a town council meeting. No one here is required to speak. No one here is required to prove they deserved help before receiving it." A few people lowered their eyes. Mara continued, "Some of our neighbors have been harmed by systems that looked helpful from the outside. Some lost property. Some lost money. Some lost trust. Some lost the belief that anyone would listen without making them feel foolish." Her gaze moved through the pews, steady but not accusing. "Tonight is a beginning, not an ending." That mattered. Elias could almost feel the room loosen at the words. A beginning was smaller than justice, easier to hold. Lydia spoke next, briefly and with no patience for decorative language. She explained that winter hardship could become medical danger quickly for older residents and disabled workers. She offered basic wellness checks after the gathering. She also informed the room that anyone who skipped medication because of heating bills would be personally haunted by her. "And I am very efficient." That earned the first real laugh of the night. Then Eileen Mercer stood. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. She spoke of her husband's workshop, the funeral bills, the man who had called her Mrs. Mercer, in a voice so gentle she mistook it for respect. Cal Hobb spoke after her, then Mr. Nellis with his hearing aid whistling faintly until Lydia marched over and adjusted it with the authority of a field general. The stories did not explode, they accumulated. One candle did not light the church. A dozen did. Rory never stood, but at one point he raised his head and looked toward Amos's closed side room. His face showed the terrible relief of a man whose worst truth had left his mouth and not killed him, though it had not saved him either. Celeste wrote only 3 times. That restraint made the notes feel more important. Finally, Mara turned toward the side room. "Amos," she said gently. The door opened. Amos stepped out with the violin in one hand and the bow in the other. The room went silent in a way Elias had never heard from a crowd. Not polite silence, not curious silence. A silence with its hat in its hands. Amos crossed to the front slowly. His cane tapped once, twice, then stopped when he reached the small open space before the pews. He did not stand behind the pulpit. That would have made it a speech. He stood beside it under the plain wooden cross on the wall, where the light from the stained glass fell faintly across his coat. Maddox rose. Elias almost signaled him down, but Amos looked toward the aisle and gave the smallest nod. The shepherd walked forward and sat at the end of the front pew, straight-backed, solemn, like a sentry assigned to guard the fragile. Amos looked at him. "Well," he said to the room, voice rough, "at least one of you came for the right reason." A soft ripple of laughter passed through the pews. The tremor in Amos's hands eased a fraction. He lifted the violin. For one breath, he looked impossibly old. Not weak, old in the way mountains are old, carrying weather, buried fires, and names carved by vanished men. Then he placed the instrument beneath his chin. The first note was not beautiful. It came out low and frayed, with a rough edge where the repaired wood carried its scar. Someone in the back shifted. Amos's jaw tightened. Elias felt his own body prepare to will the old man through the next breath. Then Maddox lowered his head onto his paws and stayed. Amos saw it. He drew the bow again. The second note held longer. The melody emerged slowly, not as performance, but as memory finding a road under snow. It was the same tune Julian Cross had taught him years before, though no one in the church knew that. They only knew what it did to the room. It did not ask for pity. It did not beg to be admired. It sounded like a man walking back through every place where he had been made small and refusing to disappear there. A bad road overseas, a burned truck, a violin case thrown clear, a house on Juniper Row, a diner step, a broken bridge of wood, a town that had preferred rumor because rumor did not ask anyone to change. The notes wavered. Amos kept playing. At some point, Elias realized his hands had closed into fists, not from anger, but from holding too much feeling in one place. Mara wiped beneath one eye with the heel of her hand and pretended to adjust her glasses. Lydia did not pretend at all. Eileen Mercer pressed both hands over her mouth. Mr. Nellis bowed his head. Rory cried silently in the back corner, which did not erase what he had done, but did prove there was still something in him capable of being wounded by it. When the last note faded, the church remained silent. Amos lowered the violin. No one clapped at first. That was the mercy of it. For a few seconds, they let the song stand. Then Cal Hobbs struck his cane once against the floor. Not applause, a salute. Another cane followed, then hands. Then the room rose, not in a roaring ovation, but slowly, awkwardly, like people unused to honoring anyone without first being told how. Amos looked overwhelmed. Maddox stood, walked to him, and pressed his head against the old man's thigh. Amos's hand came down into the dog's fur. He did not bow. He did not need to. After that night, things did not become easy. They became possible. Celesta's investigation expanded within the week. The Brightpine Community Renewal Partnership had its accounts frozen pending review. Gideon Pruitt resigned from the town council to avoid distracting from the town's important winter initiatives, a sentence Mara read aloud in the library with such disgust that Lydia told her to drink water before she injured her sarcasm. Dalton was questioned in connection with the robbery and the vandalism at Elias's cabin. Tate Berenger and Len Cobb were picked up after one tried to leave town in a truck with bald tires and poor judgment. Rory gave a fuller statement, hands shaking through every page. None of it restored everything. That was important. Justice did not arrive like spring, melting the snow in one glorious morning. It came like thaw, slow, muddy, uneven, revealing damage as much as ground. Amos's house on Juniper Row was not simply handed back with a ribbon around the key. The deed remained tangled in hearings, filings, and legal reviews. But Celeste secured a temporary protective order freezing any further transfer. Amos was allowed to return as a protected resident while the case moved forward. The first day he stepped inside, he did not smile. Elias had expected him to. Foolishly, maybe. But Amos stood in the doorway of the little house and looked at the empty front room, at the dust along the baseboards, at the place where his wife's chair had once sat, and his face went very quiet. "Funny," he said. "A house can remember you and still not know what to say." So the town began speaking for it. Not all at once, not everyone. A retired roofer patched the leak over the kitchen. Owen Pike repaired the porch rail. Lydia bullied 2 young volunteers into moving firewood. Mara brought boxes of forms, envelopes, and a lamp because she said every revolution required decent lighting. Leonard Pike set a small table by the window where Amos could keep the violin case. No one called it making amends. That would have sounded too clean. They just came with tools. On the first Friday evening, Amos opened the front room. There were only 7 people. Eileen came with a casserole. Cal came for coffee and claimed he had no interest in conversation, then talked for 40 minutes. Mr. Nellis brought a broken pocket watch and asked if anyone knew how to make time behave. Lydia checked blood pressure in the corner. Mara took down names of residents who needed help with housing documents. Leonard adjusted the violin's bridge and complained about the room's humidity, as if humidity were a moral failing. Elias stood near the doorway with Maddox, feeling the strange discomfort of belonging somewhere before he had agreed to it. "What do we call this?" Mara asked, pen ready. Amos looked at the repaired violin on its table. "The crossroom," he said. No one asked why. They knew enough. By late winter, the crossroom had become a Friday habit. Not a charity office, not a shelter, just a warm front room where people could be seen before they were sorted into problems. Elias and 2 former bridge workers started taking weekend repair calls from older residents. Steps, stovepipes, loose gutters, windows that let in too much cold. He did not return to the Pruitt contracts. He did not miss them. Maddox appointed himself manager of the crossroom with no vote and no opposition. He greeted visitors, inspected cookie tins, lay beside whoever looked most likely to cry, and once stole a pair of Lydia's gloves, carrying them proudly beneath the table until she accused him of organized textile crime. Amos played by the window now, not for coins, for arrivals. The sound was still rough. The violin still carried its scar. Some nights his hands shook and the notes wandered off like confused sheep. Leonard would wince theatrically. Amos would threaten to play louder. Maddox would sigh and stay anyway. One late winter morning, snow began melting from the roof of the Juniper Row house in bright drops. Elias stood on the porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands. Maddox sat beside his boot, watching the street with the content vigilance of a dog whose work had finally expanded to include peace. Inside, Amos played Julian's song. The melody drifted through the open window, old and cracked and warm. Elias looked down the street. Brightpine was still Brightpine. Some people would always prefer Pretty Lies. Some damage would take years to name. Some papers would move slowly through rooms where no one played music. But a house that had once been taken now had light in its windows. People came there on Fridays. An old Marine no longer played to be ignored. And Elias Ward, who had spent years returning only to silence, now had somewhere to stand while someone inside called others in from the cold. Maddox leaned against his leg. Elias rested one hand on the dog's head. The violin continued. Not perfect, never again perfect, but alive. And sometimes, Elias thought, that was the holiest sound winter could give back. Sometimes healing does not arrive as a grand miracle. Sometimes it begins with one person refusing to look away, one loyal dog staying close, and one broken song finding the courage to be heard again. This story reminds us that what is damaged is not always ruined. A cracked violin can still carry music. A forgotten man can still carry honor. And a quiet act of kindness can become the first warm light in someone else's winter. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about a time when someone helped you feel seen again. And if you'd like more stories of loyalty, hope, and second chances, please subscribe and stay with us. May God bring peace to your home, strength to your heart, and remind you that even after loss, your song is not over.